Telling my sister wives that I'm leaving. This isn't going to be a surprise.
By the time Robyn began to recognize what peacemaking had taken from her, the role had already reshaped the entire family dynamic. Not just emotionally, structurally. Peacekeeping doesn't just affect the person doing it, it teaches everyone else how to behave. And Robyn was starting to see how her constant mediation had quietly changed what was expected from everyone involved. When conflict appeared, others didn't slow down. They waited. They waited for Robyn to explain. They waited for Robyn to soften. They waited for Robyn to redirect the moment into something survivable. That waited told her something she hadn't wanted to see before. Her peacemaking had become a substitute for accountability. Instead of addressing issues directly, people relied on Robyn to translate discomfort into something easier to accept. Instead of adjusting behavior, they relied on her to adjust tone. Instead of repairing damage, they relied on her to reduce fallout. Robyn had been doing the emotional cleanup work, and cleanup work never fixes the source of the mess. This realization hit hard because it meant something painful. By constantly keeping the peace, she had unintentionally helped maintain the very patterns that were hurting everyone. That's a devastating truth for a peacemaker. Robyn didn't want to believe it at first. Her instinct was to protect the role, to justify it, to explain why it was necessary. But silence had given her perspective, and perspective made denial difficult. She could now see how often her voice was used to close conversations prematurely, how often tension was resolved without anything actually changing, how often harmony was achieved through suppression rather than understanding. That kind of peace is fragile. It looks stable, but it depends entirely on one person continuing to bend. Robyn felt the weight of that realization settling in. If peace only existed when she absorbed discomfort, then peace wasn't shared, it was outsourced, and she was the one paying the bill. She began to notice how rarely others adjusted their behavior after she stepped in, how patterns repeated despite her careful explanations, how the same conversations kept resurfacing, only slightly rephrased. That repetition drained her. It made her question the value of her effort. Peacemaking had promised resolution. What it delivered was stasis. The family wasn't moving forward, it was circling. Robyn also started noticing how her role limited her emotional range. She wasn't allowed to be confused, reactive, or unsure. Those emotions created instability, and instability was the very thing she was expected to prevent. So she swallowed them. Again and again. But swallowed emotions don't disappear. They accumulate, and accumulation changes people quietly. Robyn felt herself becoming more cautious, more reserved, less spontaneous. Not because she lacked feelings, but because expressing them felt risky. Any honest reaction might escalate things, and escalation had always been her responsibility to avoid. That's when peacemaking crossed into self-control, bordering on self-denial. She was managing not just others' emotions, but her own, constantly. That kind of management is unsustainable. Robyn began to realize that the cost of peacemaking wasn't just exhaustion, it was invisibility. Her inner world was shrinking, her reactions were filtered before they were felt, her needs were postponed indefinitely. And postponed needs don't vanish. They wait. This awareness created a quiet internal conflict. Robyn still valued peace, she still believed in loyalty, she still wanted stability, but she could no longer ignore that peace had been built on her silence, flexibility, and restraint, not on shared effort. She was the foundation no one saw, and foundations crack first. Robyn didn't announce this realization, she didn't confront anyone with it. Instead, it began to change how she behaved in subtle ways. She paused longer before speaking. She asked fewer follow-up questions. She stopped volunteering explanations. Not dramatically, deliberately. This shift wasn't rebellion. It was reassessment. She was testing whether peace could exist without her constant intervention, or whether intervention was the only thing holding everything together. The answer wasn't comforting. Without Robyn smoothing things over, discomfort surfaced quickly. Conversations became awkward. Tension lingered. Responsibility didn't move. It stayed attached to the people who created it. That made others uncomfortable. But it made something else clear. Peace hadn't been mutual. It had been maintained. By her. Robyn began to understand that peacemaking had delayed necessary reckonings. It had prevented difficult conversations from fully unfolding. It had allowed imbalance to persist under the guise of harmony. And once she saw that, she couldn't unsee it. Her role no longer felt noble. It felt costly. Not just to her, but to everyone. Because peace that avoids truth eventually collapses under the weight of what's unspoken. Robyn wasn't ready to abandon the peacemaker identity yet. Letting go of it meant redefining who she was in the family. But she could no longer fully inhabit it either. That tension pulled her towards something new. Silence. Not as punishment, not as avoidance, but as a way to stop enabling a system that relied on her emotional labor to function. When Robyn finally began stepping back from the peacemaker role, the change wasn't loud. It was unsettling. For years, the family had operated with an unspoken assumption. Tension would arise, emotions would escalate, and Robyn would step in to stabilize the moment. That pattern was so ingrained that no one questioned it, until it stopped happening. Robyn didn't announce that she was stepping back. She didn't frame it as a boundary. She simply stopped filling the space the way she always had. She paused instead of intervening. She listened instead of translating. She allowed discomfort to exist without immediately trying to neutralize it. That absence was felt immediately. Conversations didn't reset the way they used to. Awkward moments lingered. Statements landed harder because they weren't softened or reframed. Emotional responsibility stayed attached to the people who created it. And that made everyone uncomfortable. Cody noticed it first. He was used to Robyn acting as a stabilizing force, someone who would contextualize his words, explain his intent, and help others see where he was coming from. When she stopped doing that automatically, his frustration became more visible. Not because Robyn had changed sides, but because she had stopped buffering. Without her intervention, Cody's tone and reaction stood on their own. There was no immediate reassurance that things would be smoothed over, no quiet alignment to absorb emotional impact. Robyn saw this happen, and she didn't step in. Not out of defiance, not out of resentment, but out of recognition. She recognized that stepping in would only restart the cycle she was trying to understand. She had already learned that peace created through mediation didn't last. It simply postponed the reckoning. Others felt the shift as well. Some grew uneasy. They waited for Robyn to speak, to redirect the conversation, to restore balance. When she didn't, the silence felt heavier than conflict ever had. That silence exposed something important. The family had become dependent on Robyn's emotional labor. Dependency doesn't always look dramatic. Often, it looks like expectation. The expectation that someone else will manage the emotional aftermath. The expectation that someone else will keep things from falling apart. Robyn had been that someone, and now she wasn't. This forced a reckoning, not one that was spoken aloud, but one that was felt. People were confronted with their own discomfort, their own responsibility, their own unresolved issues. Robyn wasn't creating tension. She was allowing it to be experienced. That distinction mattered deeply to her. For the first time, she wasn't rushing to preserve peace at her own expense. She wasn't smoothing things over so others could avoid reflection. She was letting reality stand unfiltered. This wasn't easy. There were moments when Robyn felt the old instinct surge, the urge to step in, to calm things down, to prevent escalation. Peacemaking was second nature to her. Letting go of it felt like letting something break. But she stayed still. And staying still changed everything. Without Robyn's mediation, patterns became impossible to ignore. The same voices dominated. The same frustrations resurfaced. The same imbalances repeated. What had once been softened by her presence now stood exposed. That exposure wasn't flattering, but it was honest. Robyn began to understand that her peacemaking hadn't just been costly, it had been concealing. It concealed imbalance, it concealed accountability, it concealed how little had actually changed beneath the surface. By stepping back, she wasn't harming the family. She was revealing it. This revelation also changed how Robyn felt internally. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't emotionally exhausted after every difficult conversation. She wasn't replaying exchanges in her head, wondering what she could have said differently to keep the peace. She felt lighter. Not relieved, lighter. Because she was no longer carrying everyone else's emotional weight. That lightness came with guilt at first. Peacemakers are conditioned to feel guilty when they stop intervening. Guilt that things might escalate, guilt that others might suffer discomfort, guilt that silence equals neglect. Robyn wrestled with that guilt, but she also noticed something important. The discomfort others felt wasn't new. It had always been there. She had just been absorbing it.
Realizing that helped her stay grounded. It reminded her that stepping back wasn't abandonment, it was redistribution. Emotional responsibility was finally being shared, even if unevenly. This phase marked a visible turning point. Robyn was no longer functioning as the emotional glue, and without that glue, the structure began to show strain. Unity felt fragile, harmony felt performative, stability felt conditional. Robyn didn't rush to fix any of it. She couldn't, and she finally accepted that. By the time Robyn fully understood the cost of being the peacemaker, the role no longer felt confusing. It felt complete. Not resolved, complete.
She could finally see the full shape of what she had been doing for years and what it had taken from her in return. Peacemaking hadn't failed because she stopped trying. It failed because it was never meant to be carried by one person alone. That realization settled in quietly. Robyn recognized that peace had been mistaken for stability. Calm moments were treated as proof that things were working, even though nothing underneath had changed. Her role had been to keep things from erupting, not to help them heal. And healing never happened. What did happen was repetition. The same conversations, the same frustrations, the same emotional imbalance, just managed more carefully each time. Robyn had been smoothing the surface while the structure weakened underneath. That understanding was painful because it meant her effort hadn't been building something lasting. It had been delaying an inevitable reckoning, and in delaying it, she had paid with her own emotional clarity. Robyn began to accept something that peacemakers struggle to accept. You can care deeply and still be part of a broken system. Good intentions do not correct imbalance. Patience does not create accountability, and silence does not cause collapse. It reveals it. By stepping back, Robyn finally allowed herself to stop carrying responsibility that was never truly hers. She saw that harmony had been dependent on her constant flexibility. The moment she stopped bending, the imbalance became obvious. That was the real cost, not just exhaustion, not just frustration, but the realization that peace had been conditional on her self-erasure. Robyn felt grief for the role she had believed in. She had genuinely thought peacemaking was the most loving thing she could do. She believed that if she stayed calm long enough, things would stabilize. Letting go of that belief felt like mourning a version of herself. But grief didn't weaken her. It clarified her limits. Robyn understood now that staying quiet wasn't passive. It was a refusal to continue absorbing emotional labor without authority or reciprocity. She wasn't punishing anyone. She wasn't making a statement. She was protecting herself. That protection felt unfamiliar at first. Peacemakers are trained to prioritize others' comfort over their own boundaries. Choosing self-preservation can feel selfish when you've spent years being praised for sacrifice. Robyn had to unlearn that. She stopped asking how to restore peace and started asking a different question. What am I willing to carry and what am I not? The answer reshaped everything. She was willing to listen, she was willing to be present, she was willing to remain connected. But she was no longer willing to translate, soften, absorb, and excuse. Those tasks had cost her too much. This phase marked the point where silence stopped being experimental and became permanent. Robyn no longer waited to see if she should step back in. She no longer second-guessed her restraint. The decision had been made internally. She was done performing peace. That didn't mean chaos followed. What followed was clarity. Clarity about who adjusted and who didn't. Clarity about who expected flexibility and who offered it. Clarity about which relationships relied on her self-suppression to function. That clarity was sobering. Robyn didn't feel victorious. She felt grounded. Grounded in the knowledge that peace achieved through personal sacrifice isn't peace. It's postponement. And postponement always comes due. By the end of this phase, Robyn accepted that the family's stability could not depend on her continued silence or endurance. If unity required her to disappear emotionally, then unity was already broken. That acceptance didn't lead to confrontation. It led to boundaries. Quiet ones, firm ones, unapologetic ones. Robyn didn't need to explain those boundaries. She had explained enough for a lifetime. Silence became her final form of honesty. After Robyn stopped paying the cost of peacemaking, the aftermath didn't look dramatic. It looked unfamiliar. For years, her identity had been intertwined with mediation. When conflict arose, she moved towards it. When emotions escalated, she absorbed them. When unity felt fragile, she reinforced it. Stepping out of that role didn't leave a vacuum overnight. It created a slow, disorienting quiet. And that quiet forced change. Robyn began to notice how different her days felt when she wasn't constantly anticipating conflict. She wasn't scanning conversations for danger. She wasn't rehearsing explanations in her head before anyone even spoke. Her emotional energy, once reserved for maintenance, became available for reflection. Reflection revealed how deeply peacemaking had shaped her behavior.
She realized how often she had postponed her own reactions to accommodate others, how frequently she had overridden her instincts to keep situations calm, how rarely she had asked herself whether peace was being achieved fairly. That awareness didn't come with regret. It came with relief. Relief that she no longer had to perform emotional flexibility on demand. Relief that silence could exist without catastrophe. Relief that she could remain present without being responsible for outcomes she couldn't control.
The family felt the change too. Without Robyn's mediation, conflicts didn't resolve as quickly. Conversations stalled, discomfort lingered. Some issues resurfaced without a familiar soft landing. This was uncomfortable for everyone, but discomfort is not damage. Robyn understood that distinction now. Previously, she had treated discomfort as a problem to be solved. Now she recognized it as information about imbalance, unmet needs, and avoided accountability. By stepping back, Robyn allowed that information to surface. She wasn't trying to teach a lesson. She wasn't trying to force change. She was simply refusing to interfere with natural consequences. That refusal required strength. Peacemakers are often conditioned to believe that silence equals neglect, that stepping back is the same as giving up. Robyn had to sit with that fear and realize it wasn't true. She still cared. She just cared differently. Care no longer meant intervention. It meant discernment. It meant choosing when engagement was healthy and when it was harmful. This discernment reshaped her relationships. Some connections adapted, others strained. Without Robyn smoothing every interaction, patterns became more obvious. Who adjusted, who didn't, who listened, who expected accommodation. Robyn didn't comment on these patterns. She observed them. Observation gave her clarity without confrontation. She no longer needed to argue for fairness. She could see where it existed and where it didn't. She no longer needed to explain her boundaries. They were expressed through consistency. Consistency is powerful. The more Robyn maintained her silence, the less pressure she felt to justify it. She realized she didn't owe anyone an explanation for protecting her emotional capacity. Explanations had been her default for too long, and they had cost her dearly. Now she let action speak. She spoke when it mattered. She stayed quiet when it didn't. She remained steady when tension rose. That steadiness changed how she saw herself. Robyn was no longer the peacemaker holding everything together. She was someone who trusted that systems should be able to support themselves, and if they couldn't, that wasn't her failure. This was a profound shift. It allowed her to release guilt she had been carrying for years, guilt for conflicts she couldn't fix, guilt for emotions she couldn't soothe, guilt for outcomes she couldn't control. That guilt had been misplaced. Letting go of it felt like setting something heavy down after a long time. Robyn's silence didn't repair the family, but it repaired her relationship with herself. She felt more grounded, more present, less reactive. She didn't feel the constant need to manage impressions or protect others from discomfort. She allowed herself to exist without a role. That was new and freeing. This phase also revealed something important. Peace that depends on one person's sacrifice is fragile. Once Robyn stepped back, it became clear that stability had been conditional all along. That wasn't her fault. It was the truth. Robyn accepted that truth without bitterness. She didn't need to assign blame. She didn't need to rewrite history. She simply acknowledged reality as it was, not as she wished it could be. That acceptance marked the true cost of peacemaking. Not the exhaustion, not the silence, but the delayed truth. Robyn had crossed a threshold. She was no longer experimenting with boundaries or questioning her decision to step back. She had integrated the lesson fully. Peace could not come at the expense of self. Harmony could not be built on one person's flexibility. Love could not require disappearance. Robyn wasn't angry about what peacemaking had cost her. She was clear.
Once Robyn stopped carrying the weight of peace for everyone else, something unexpected happened. Her power returned. Not the kind of power that dominates a room, not authority or control, but emotional power, the power to decide what she would and would not carry. For years, Robyn's peacemaking had quietly trained that power away. Each time she intervened, she absorbed pressure that belonged elsewhere. Each time she softened a conflict, she removed consequences that might have forced change. Her effort kept things calm, but it also kept her constrained. Stepping back reversed that. Without constantly managing outcomes, Robyn felt a steadiness she hadn't known in years. She was no longer reacting to tension the moment it appeared. She could pause, observe, choose. Choice is power. Previously, her role had been automatic. Conflict triggered intervention. Discomfort triggered explanation. Now, nothing was automatic. Every response was deliberate. That deliberateness changed how others related to her. Some felt unsettled by it. They were used to Robyn as emotional infrastructure, always present, always responsive, always smoothing things over. When that infrastructure disappeared, interactions felt heavier. But heaviness wasn't harm. It was honesty. Robyn could see how often emotional responsibility had been rerouted to her simply because she was willing to carry it. Once she stopped volunteering, that responsibility had nowhere to go but back to its source. That redistribution altered the balance of power in the family, not because Robyn demanded it, but because she no longer prevented it. Cody, in particular, felt this shift.
Without Robyn immediately contextualizing his reactions, his words carried their full impact. There was no buffer, no translation, no emotional insulation. He had to sit with responses he once avoided. Robyn noticed this, and for the first time, she didn't feel responsible for managing it. That freedom was profound. She wasn't withholding support to punish anyone. She was simply no longer overfunctioning. Overfunctioning had been mistaken for loyalty, but it had actually weakened everyone involved. By stepping back, Robyn allowed others to experience the consequences of their own emotional patterns. She didn't correct, she didn't soften, she didn't redirect. She held still. Holding still requires strength, especially for peacemakers. It means resisting the urge to fix, to soothe, to save. It means trusting that discomfort can be productive. Robyn learned that trust, and with it came confidence. Confidence not rooted in being needed, but in being grounded. She didn't need validation for her silence. She didn't need approval for her restraint. Her sense of self no longer depended on how well she managed others' emotions. That independence reshaped her identity. Robyn began to see herself not as the keeper of peace, but as an equal participant, one whose needs mattered as much as anyone else's. That reframing changed how she spoke when she did speak. Her words were fewer, but they carried more weight. Silence had restored value to her voice. This phase also clarified something essential. Power doesn't always come from engagement. Sometimes it comes from refusal. Refusal to absorb what isn't yours. Refusal to mediate what shouldn't be mediated. Refusal to disappear for the sake of comfort. Robyn's refusal was quiet, but it was firm, and firmness changed the dynamic permanently. She no longer chased harmony. She allowed it to exist or not based on shared effort. That distinction mattered. It removed pressure from her shoulders and placed it where it belonged. By the end of this phase, Robyn understood that being the peacemaker had cost her autonomy. Stepping out of that role restored it. She wasn't more distant, she was more whole. With her power restored, Robyn's silence stopped being reactive and started becoming intentional. It pointed somewhere. Before, her energy had been spent managing the present, calming arguments, smoothing misunderstandings, preventing emotional blow-ups. Now, with that energy reclaimed, she began thinking about the future in a way she hadn't allowed herself to before. Not the family's future, her own. Robyn realized how rarely she had asked what she wanted beyond keeping things stable. Stability had become the goal because instability felt dangerous. But stability achieved through constant self-sacrifice was no longer something she was willing to chase. Silence created space for that realization. Without the pressure to intervene, Robyn noticed how much calmer she felt in her own body. She wasn't bracing the conflict. She wasn't rehearsing explanations. She wasn't anticipating emotional fallout. Her nervous system finally rested. That rest revealed something important. She had been living in a constant state of emotional vigilance.
Peacemaking had trained her to stay alert, to read moods, to intervene before things escalated. Letting go of that vigilance felt unfamiliar and freeing. Robyn began trusting herself to tolerate discomfort without fixing it. She learned that not every difficult moment needed her involvement. Some situations resolved themselves. Others revealed truths that had been buried under her mediation. Either way, silence gave her information, and information shaped her direction. Robyn stopped planning her responses around how others might react. Instead, she considered how she felt, what she could handle, and what she was no longer willing to compromise. Those considerations began guiding her decisions quietly. She wasn't plotting exits or making ultimatums. She was recalibrating. This recalibration changed how she approached relationships. She invested energy where there was reciprocity. She pulled back where there was expectation without care. She no longer stretched herself thin to maintain appearances. That selectivity wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. Robyn also began to understand that peacemaking had kept her tethered to roles that no longer fit. Silence loosened those ties. She could see that she didn't need to be central to every emotional exchange to belong. Belonging didn't require overfunctioning. That understanding reshaped her sense of security. Security no longer came from being indispensable. It came from knowing she could stand on her own without collapsing relationships. Silence gave her that confidence. She also noticed how her quiet presence influenced others over time. People adjusted. Some respected her boundaries. Others pushed against them. Those reactions told her more than words ever could. She didn't confront those reactions. She observed them. Observation helped her decide where to invest and where to disengage. It allowed her to move forward without drama, without blame, without the need to explain herself endlessly. That restraint shaped her future more effectively than confrontation ever could. Robyn's silence wasn't closing doors. It was opening paths. Paths that didn't revolve around crisis management. Paths that didn't demand constant emotional labor. Paths that allowed her to exist without being consumed by the family's instability. This phase marked the moment when Robyn stopped seeing peacemaking as a virtue and started seeing self-preservation as necessary. She no longer framed boundaries as failures.
She framed them as survival, and survival changed her priorities. She prioritized steadiness over approval. She prioritized honesty over harmony. She prioritized self-respect over endurance. Those priorities guided her quietly forward. Robyn no longer questioned whether stepping out of the peacemaker role was the right choice. The answer was evident in how she felt. Calmer, clearer, less divided internally. Silence had become her direction. Not a retreat, not an ending. A way forward that didn't require her to disappear.
By this stage, Robyn's silence had stopped being something she used. It had become something she was. The peacemaker identity that once defined her no longer fit, and without it, Robyn had to confront a deeper question than she ever had before. Who am I when I'm not holding everything together? For years, her sense of value came from usefulness. Being needed meant being important. Being central to emotional stability meant having purpose. Peacemaking gave her a clear role in a complex family structure. But silence removed that role, and in its place, something unfamiliar emerged: self-definition. Robyn began to notice how different she felt when she wasn't constantly monitoring reactions or preparing explanations. She was no longer preoccupied with preventing escalation. She wasn't anticipating emotional fallout before it happened. That mental quiet allowed her to feel her own emotions without immediately converting them into action. For the first time, she could feel frustration without fixing it, sadness without softening it, disappointment without explaining it away. That freedom changed her relationship with herself. She realized how often she had treated her own emotions as obstacles to harmony. Anything that disrupted peace had been set aside. Silence allowed those emotions to exist without judgment. And that was transformative. Robyn's identity shifted from the one who stabilizes to the one who understands her limits. That shift didn't make her colder. It made her steadier. She no longer felt compelled to justify her presence through effort. She didn't need to earn her place by absorbing tension. Her worth no longer depended on being emotionally indispensable. That realization was powerful. It also clarified how much peacemaking had asked her to abandon parts of herself. Spontaneity, vulnerability, honest reaction, those parts had been sacrificed to maintain calm. Silence gave them room to return. Robyn became more selective about when she spoke and why. Her words were no longer shaped by how they might land, but by whether they were true. When she did speak, she wasn't mediating, she was expressing. That difference was subtle but profound. People noticed that her voice carried more weight now, not because she spoke louder, but because she spoke less. Silence had restored meaning to her words. This phase also revealed something difficult. Some relationships only functioned when she was over-functioning. Without her peacemaking, those connections felt strained, even hollow. Robyn didn't try to fix that. She accepted it. Acceptance is a form of strength peacemakers rarely allow themselves. It means acknowledging that not every bond can survive without self-sacrifice, and choosing not to sacrifice anyway. Robyn chose herself. Not aggressively, not defiantly, but quietly and consistently. She no longer measured success by harmony. She measured it by alignment between what she felt and how she lived. Alignment replaced obligation. That internal alignment changed how she moved through the family dynamic. She wasn't reactive, she wasn't defensive, she wasn't eager to resolve things prematurely. She was grounded, and grounding changes everything. Robyn understood that the cost of being the peacemaker wasn't just exhaustion, it was the slow loss of self. Stepping out of that role allowed her to reclaim pieces of her identity she hadn't realized were missing. Silence didn't take anything away from her. It gave her back to herself. By the end of this journey, there was nothing left for Robyn to manage. No tension to soften, no narrative to protect, no peace to perform. What remained was clarity. Robyn finally understood that the role of peacemaker had never been neutral. It had shaped her decisions, filtered her emotions, and slowly trained her to disappear for the sake of stability. What once felt like strength had become a quiet form of self-erasure, and stepping away from it wasn't failure. It was resolution. Robyn no longer questioned whether she should step back. That question belonged to an earlier version of herself, the one who believed peace was her responsibility to maintain. Now she knew better. Peace that depends on one person's sacrifice is not peace. It's postponement, and postponement always comes due. By choosing silence, Robyn didn't abandon loyalty. She redefined it. Loyalty no longer meant absorbing emotional fallout, translating behavior, or protecting others from consequences. It meant staying honest about her limits and refusing to cross them again. That honesty changed how she lived inside the family dynamic. She was present, but not available on demand. She was engaged, but not responsible for outcomes. She was loyal, but not invisible. This balance was the ending she hadn't known she needed. Robyn didn't become colder or detached. She became steadier, less reactive, less divided internally.
The constant tension between who she was and who she needed to be to keep the peace finally dissolved. Silence did what years of explaining never could. It aligned her. She no longer needed to argue for her worth. She no longer needed to justify her boundaries. She no longer needed to rescue relationships that only survived when she disappeared inside them. Those relationships revealed themselves for what they were, and Robyn accepted that without bitterness. Acceptance was the final cost and the final gift of being the peacemaker. The cost was seeing the truth clearly. The gift was no longer having to carry it alone. This is why Robyn stopped, not because she stopped caring, not because she gave up, but because she finally chose herself. And that choice didn't end the story. It ended the part where she kept paying for peace with her own identity. That's the real cost of being the peacemaker. And that's where Robyn's story finds its quiet, honest end.
For a long time, Robyn Brown was defined by one role above all others, the peacemaker. In Sister Wives, whenever tension rose, Robyn was the one who leaned forward. She clarified intentions. She softened words. She tried to hold space for everyone at once. While others expressed frustration or withdrew, Robyn stayed engaged. At first, this looked like strength. Peacemakers are often praised. They're seen as mature, loyal, emotionally intelligent. Robyn was framed as someone who understood Cody, who believed in unity, who could calm storms before they broke apart. But what rarely gets discussed is what peacemaking actually costs over time. Because peace doesn't come from nowhere. Someone pays for it. And for years, that someone was Robyn. Robyn entered the family believing conflict could be managed if everyone felt heard. She believed explanations mattered. She believed loyalty meant staying engaged even when things were uncomfortable. When disagreements arose, she didn't step back, she stepped in. That habit became her identity. Whenever Cody spoke harshly, Robyn reframed his words. Whenever emotions flared, she tried to slow things down. Whenever conversations felt close to breaking, she redirected them toward calm. Over time, this role stopped being a choice. It became an expectation. The family began to rely on Robyn not just to participate, but to regulate. Her presence wasn't neutral, it was stabilizing. And once someone becomes stabilizing, the system adjusts around them. Conflict is allowed to exist because someone else will absorb it. Robyn absorbed it. What viewers didn't see immediately was how often Robyn spoke for others rather than as herself. Her words were frequently about context, intention, or understanding, rarely about her own unmet needs. Peacemaking demands self-suppression. To calm a situation, you soften your own reactions. To maintain harmony, you delay your own emotions. To protect unity, you become flexible where others are rigid. Robyn did this repeatedly, and at first, she believed it was working. The family still existed. The structure still stood. The show continued. From the outside, peacemaking looked effective, but effectiveness isn't the same as sustainability. As years passed, the same conflicts resurfaced, the same grievances went unresolved, the same emotional imbalances remained, just quieter. Robyn's peacemaking didn't fix the cracks, it covered them. Covering cracks requires constant effort. You have to keep smoothing, explaining, reassuring. You have to stay alert for tension so it never fully erupts. That vigilance is exhausting. Robyn was always listening, always reading the room, always anticipating reactions. She learned when to speak, how to phrase things, and when to redirect conversations before they escalated. That level of emotional monitoring takes a toll. But peacemakers rarely complain, because complaining feels like causing the very conflict they're trying to avoid. Instead, they endure. Robyn endured. Over time, something subtle happened. The family dynamic began to depend on her endurance. Emotional labor slowly centralized around her. Others expressed frustration freely, knowing Robyn would step in to manage the aftermath. That wasn't intentional, it was structural. When one person consistently absorbs tension, others stop doing that work themselves. Accountability shifts. Emotional responsibility becomes uneven. Robyn didn't notice this immediately. Peacemakers are often the last to realize they're being overused. They believe they're choosing the role. They believe they can step out anytime. But when they finally try to pull back, the system resists. Because the system has adapted. Robyn's peacemaking became invisible labor. It wasn't celebrated anymore. It was assumed. When peace existed, it was taken for granted. When peace failed, Robyn felt responsible. That's a dangerous position. It places the burden of harmony on one person, without giving them authority to change the conditions that disrupt it. Robyn could explain decisions, but she didn't make them. She could soften reactions, but she couldn't enforce fairness. She could encourage understanding, but she couldn't demand accountability. Her role had limits, and those limits became painful. The cost of being the peacemaker isn't immediate, it accumulates. Each time you suppress frustration, it adds up. Each time you translate someone else's behavior, it distances you from your own truth. Robyn started to feel that distance. She still cared deeply, she still wanted unity, but she also felt increasingly tired, not physically, but emotionally, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying responsibility without control. Her voice began to feel less effective. No matter how carefully she spoke, outcomes stayed the same. Her explanations no longer moved the family forward. They just kept things from falling apart.
That's when peacemaking stops feeling meaningful. It starts feeling like maintenance. Maintenance keeps things running, but it doesn't improve them. It just prevents collapse. Robyn was maintaining a structure that wasn't healing. And deep down, she knew it.
This awareness didn't arrive with anger. It arrived quietly, in moments where she realized she was explaining the same things again, in conversations where she noticed no one else adjusting their behavior, in situations where her emotional labor was expected but not reciprocated. She began to ask herself questions she hadn't allowed before. Why am I always the one calming things down? Why does peace depend on me staying flexible? Why do I feel responsible for problems I didn't create? These questions didn't lead to immediate change. They led to hesitation. Robyn started pausing before speaking. She began choosing words more carefully. Sometimes she said less. Sometimes she said nothing at all. That was new. Silence is frightening for peacemakers. Silence feels like abandonment. It feels like letting conflict win. It feels like failing at the very role you've been praised for. Robyn struggled with that. But she also noticed something else. When she didn't step in, others felt the discomfort she had been absorbing. Tension lingered. Conversations didn't reset automatically. Responsibility stayed where it landed. That discomfort wasn't created by her silence. It had always been there. She had just been carrying it. By the time Robyn began hesitating before she spoke, the cost of peacemaking had already been paid many times over. She just hadn't added it up yet. Peacemakers don't usually notice the damage while it's happening. The role rewards you with short-term calm, not long-term clarity. Every time Robyn stepped in and soothed a situation, there was immediate relief. Tension lowered, voices softened, conflict paused. That relief felt like success. But relief is temporary, and Robyn was beginning to understand that every moment of calm came at the expense of something quieter, her own voice. Over time, peacemaking required Robyn to shrink parts of herself, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. She learned which feelings were helpful to express, and which ones complicated things. Frustration had to be softened, hurt had to be reframed, anger had to be translated into understanding. She adjusted constantly. Those adjustments didn't feel like self-erasure at first. They felt like maturity, like emotional intelligence, like being the bigger person. But being the bigger person over and over again leaves less room for yourself. Robyn noticed that conversations rarely centered on what she needed. Her role wasn't to need, it was to manage needs. She spoke about fairness, patience, and understanding, but rarely about her own limits. And when she did express discomfort, it was often redirected. Her feelings were acknowledged politely, then set aside in favor of restoring harmony. The peace always mattered more than the pain underneath it. That imbalance wears on a person. Robyn started to realize that peacemaking required her to stay emotionally flexible while others remained fixed. She bent so the structure wouldn't break, and the more she bent, the more the structure relied on her flexibility. That's how peacemakers become essential and expendable at the same time. Essential because everything collapses without them. Expendable because their needs are never prioritized. Robyn didn't see this as unfair at first. She saw it as responsibility. But responsibility without agency eventually feels like entrapment. She was expected to smooth things out, but not to change the conditions that caused the tension. She could translate Cody's frustration, but she couldn't challenge its impact. She could encourage unity, but she couldn't demand reciprocity. Her authority ended where peacekeeping began. This is where the real cost started to surface. Robyn began to feel emotionally crowded. There was no space left to be reactive, uncertain, or honest in messy ways. She had become the emotional adult in every room, even when she felt just as overwhelmed as everyone else. That pressure creates isolation. Not physical isolation, emotional isolation. Because peacemakers aren't allowed to fall apart. If they do, everything else feels at risk. Robyn carried that weight quietly. She also noticed something painful. When she was calm, it was expected. When she was tired, it was inconvenient. Her emotional availability was treated like a constant resource rather than a human capacity. That realization didn't make her angry. It made her tired in a deeper way. The kind of tiredness that rest doesn't fix. She began to feel disconnected from her own reactions. Before responding, she'd mentally scan the room. Who needs calming? Who might escalate? How should this be phrased so it lands gently? That internal monitoring became automatic and exhausting. Robyn wasn't participating in conversations anymore. She was managing them. She wasn't expressing herself. She was regulating outcomes. That distinction matters, because when you're always managing, you're never fully present. She started to notice moments where she wanted to speak honestly, not diplomatically, not carefully, but honestly, and stopped herself. Not because she was afraid, but because honesty felt disruptive, and peacemakers are trained to avoid disruption at all costs. That avoidance slowly disconnects you from your truth. Robyn felt that disconnect growing. She still believed in loyalty, she still valued unity, but she could feel a gap forming between what she felt and what she allowed herself to say. That gap is where resentment begins. Not loud resentment, quiet resentment. The kind that settles into the body, the kind that shows up as fatigue, hesitation, and withdrawal. The kind that doesn't explode, it erodes. Robyn didn't want to resent anyone. That conflicted with everything she believed about herself. So instead of confronting it, she tried to manage it the same way she managed everything else, by being calmer, by explaining more, by trying harder. But trying harder only deepened the cost, because the more she tried to keep the peace, the less peace she felt internally. This is the paradox of peacemaking. The person responsible for calm often experiences the least of it. Robyn reached a point where she began to dread conversations that required her intervention, not because she didn't care, but because she knew what they would demand of her. Care without reciprocity becomes depletion, and depletion leads to silence. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind where you pause before responding, the kind where you let a moment pass, the kind where you stop volunteering emotional labor and wait to see what happens. Robyn hadn't decided to stop being the peacemaker yet, but she was questioning whether peace that required her self-erasure was worth keeping. That question marked a turning point.
Robyn Brown has always been defined by one word: loyalty. From the moment she entered Sister Wives, her role was clear, not just as a wife, but as a stabilizer, a protector of the family structure, and often the emotional shield standing between Cody and the rest of the household. But loyalty only works when it's shared, and over time, Robyn's loyalty stopped being mutual. It started being tested. Not by one dramatic betrayal, not by a single argument, but by a slow accumulation of moments where loyalty demanded more from her than it returned. At first, Robyn's loyalty looked purposeful. She defended the family publicly. She explained Cody's anger when others felt hurt by it. She reframed conflict as misunderstanding. She absorbed criticism so others didn't have to. That wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Robyn believed that loyalty could stabilize chaos, that patience could outlast tension, that if she held her position long enough, the family would eventually realign. But loyalty is only sustainable when it's recognized, and that recognition slowly disappeared. As the family fractured, Robyn's position became increasingly isolated. She wasn't just supporting Cody, she was defending decisions she didn't make, justifying outcomes she didn't control, and absorbing resentment meant for a structure much bigger than her. That's when loyalty stopped feeling like commitment and started feeling like obligation. Robyn never wanted to be the center of the family, but circumstances placed her there anyway. As other relationships weakened, expectations narrowed. Cody leaned more heavily on her emotional support. Viewers watched as Robyn became the primary interpreter of his behavior, softening it, explaining it, translating it for others. That role came at a cost. The more Robyn defended Cody, the more isolated she became from the other wives. And the more isolated she became, the harder it was to tell whether her loyalty was protecting the family or trapping her inside it. This is where the test begins. Robyn's loyalty wasn't tested by leaving, it was tested by staying. Staying while being blamed, staying while being resented, staying while carrying responsibility without authority. That kind of loyalty demands silence, and Robyn learned to be quiet in very specific ways. She spoke carefully. She chose words that didn't escalate. She avoided framing herself as a victim. But viewers began to notice something subtle. Her tone changed, not in anger, in caution. Robyn no longer spoke with certainty. She spoke with restraint. She measured her words as if aware that anything she said could be misinterpreted, used, or turned against her. That's not confidence, that's pressure. As the family dynamic tightened, Robyn found herself defending a structure that no longer functioned the way it once did. Unity had become symbolic, rules had become selective, sacrifice had become uneven, and yet loyalty still demanded obedience. Robyn didn't question loyalty publicly, she questioned it internally. That internal conflict didn't explode, it lingered. Robyn wasn't asking herself, should I leave? She was asking, what does staying cost me now? That's a far more dangerous question. Because once someone starts measuring cost instead of duty, loyalty changes form. Robyn had built her identity around being dependable, being the one who stayed, being the one who believed. But belief without balance turns into strain, and strain eventually shows. Viewers saw it in her posture, in her pauses, in the way she stopped finishing thoughts. Robyn wasn't breaking down, she was holding back. That distinction matters. Breaking down is visible, holding back is controlled, until it isn't. The pressure on Robyn didn't come only from Cody, it came from the weight of expectations placed on her by the entire narrative of the family. She was expected to represent unity while standing inside division.
to defend decisions while having limited influence over them, to embody loyalty while being questioned for it. That contradiction erodes certainty. Robyn wasn't choosing sides anymore. She was standing alone. And loyalty feels very different when you're alone. This is where the test becomes real. Not dramatic, not explosive. Real in the quiet moments when Robyn realizes she's carrying more than she can set down, and more than anyone is acknowledging. Loyalty had once given her purpose. Now it was demanding silence. That silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. Loaded with restraint, loaded with self-control, loaded with questions she wasn't ready to answer out loud.